Religions. They're all systems of morality, they're all systems of social organisation, they're all rules for getting along and making sense of what would otherwise be a meaningless and arbitrary universe. But there's one characteristic that sets Islam apart from the others, just one, and I'm going to be talking about that after I've told you I'm Graniopteryx. Now, I'm going to get rather critical of Islam, and for that reason, I'm not even going to try to monetize this video. However, this is important enough to be said, so if you're feeling generous, yeah, be generous. Otherwise, remember to click like because that's very helpful for the algorithm. So here we have one Professor Goodwin being interviewed on GB News.
Which is the threat from radical Islamist terrorism. The advance of radical Islamist terror and violence within our society is being enabled by a radical left. We should call this what it is, like after the Manchester bombing, like after the teacher that I think is still in hiding from Birmingham, like after the attacks on school children in Kent and other counties by asylum seekers, dark, depressing sexual attacks. We should be able to call this what it is. This is a growing threat from radical Islamists. We need a serious response to it. We need to stop cowering in the aftermath, and we need to stop making these ridiculous excuses as to what's going on. These are radical Islamists. They're trying to disrupt and overturn our civilization. Let's call it what it is.
He started talking about the awful case of a British MP who isn't standing for re-election because he represents a Jewish part of London and has been so frightened by the death threats and actual attempts on his life, all coming from Muslims, that he's decided to stand down. Professor Goodwin calls it radical Islamism, as you will have seen from that video. Well, he's taken a step in the right direction, I have to admit, but it's not all that accurate. It's not radical Islamism. I'm sorry to say, it's Islam itself. Until Muslims decide that the hadiths are not to be taken all that seriously and that the Quran was not the absolute word of Allah given to the perfect example of humanity, as Muhammad is styled in Islam, then the problem is Islam itself. And what is that problem? Well, it's this. It's the difference between Islam and the other two Abrahamic religions. Islam is the difference between Islam and Hinduism. It's the difference between Islam and, Buddhism. It's the difference between Islam and, almost any other religion I can think of, which is that whereas all the other religions that I have just thought of are predicated on the idea that when you embrace whatever particular religion you hold dear, you're going to relieve the pain and suffering not only of yourself, either in this world or in the hereafter, but of everyone else, by being more holy and bringing a great message and all the rest of it. While in Islam, if you embrace it, it is your duty not to relieve pain and suffering, but to inflict pain and suffering on everyone else. Everyone else who isn't a Muslim. But even when you're in a Muslim society, if you see Muslims who don't fit your particular brand of Islam, it's your duty to inflict pain and suffering on them. It never ends. First on the Kufr, and then on the other smaller sects of Islam, and then on the other big sect of Islam, until there's nobody left. You know that one about war is not about who's right, but who's left. Yeah, anyway, let's carry on. Look, some of you might not agree with me that there are good things in the Quran and in Muslim culture, but I maintain there are. But the basic thrust of Islam right now is that you aren't a proper Muslim unless you're prepared to inflict misery on everyone who isn't a Muslim. And as I said, anyone who doesn't agree with your particular interpretation. And the idea is that if you embrace Islam, you are becoming part of an army whose avowed intention is that non-Muslims have to suffer. They must suffer for the good of the universe. And if they're not suffering physically, they have to suffer under crippling taxes. So like non-Muslim citizens of Muslim countries had a tax imposed on them called the Jiza, and sometimes it was absolutely swingeing and made sure that all the non-Muslims were kept in a state of permanent poverty. So that, as Muhammad put it, they know they're subdued and they're suffering for not being Muslims. It's a religious obligation for all Muslims to strive towards that. Now, it's perfectly true that many Muslims don't wish to act on those commandments. But there are also many who, while not acting, would at least agree with the idea. Therefore, as an example, something of an extreme example, but it's still an example, when Hamas rampaged through Israel a little while ago, hundreds of ordinary Gazan citizens who were not members of Hamas followed the terrorist hordes and looted the houses of the murdered occupants over their bodies. They could see bodies that had been burnt, that had been tortured, that had been otherwise interfered with. And they did that because, according to their interpretation of their religion, not only was this acceptable, but it was a holy act. And before anyone asks me how I know this stuff, I shall remind you that I started my university career in Manchester University studying Arabic and early Islamic culture, and I switched degrees because I was so appalled by what I was reading in the Quran that I had sleepless nights. I also want to add a caveat. There are sects of Islam which are perfectly reasonable. The Ismailis, for instance, are a reasonable sect of Islam. They are reasonable people. They are good citizens, well, as good as any other citizens. And the reason for that is their leader, the Aga Khan, is a direct descendant of Muhammad. And he can change the rules. At least that's what he says he can do. And he does. And because of that, Ismaili Islam has grown in civilization. The Ahmadis also, slightly less, but yeah. There is that possibility. But the two major sects, Sunni and Shiite, they are, and that is the sort of people we have here in this country, mostly. And the Ismailis, they keep their heads down because they are not really, and Ahmadis, heretics. So, yes, the possibility is there. So when Professor Goodwin says, you know, the problem is radical Islamic, no. It's Islam itself in the two most powerful and populous sects. That's the trouble. The whole world of Islam were Ismaili. I'd probably consider taking up that faith myself. Okay, till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.